U današnjoj emisiji nastavljamo razgovor sa Denom Pavelom Dogijem. Šta je potrebno uraditi kako bi se negativni publicitet koji prati Rome preokrenuo u njihovu korist?
I think one of the biggest damage to the perception of Roma and about Roma is done by the media. Media plays an essential role in how it shapes people's thinking, perceptions, and to a good extent, eventually, attitudes towards certain groups. There are reports, studies, and one can do very empirical exercise in the national media. Search for keywords like Roma, Tsigan, and for curiosity, see how Roma are portrayed in those articles that come up out of this exercise. Overwhelmingly, it's negative and biased. I mean, one can choose that portrays only negative parts, because every group and every society has such, but it's also biased. It's not saying what I want to show is the negative part of this community. Tries to instill in people's minds that there is no alternative but the negative, which is obviously not true. So there is a very unbalanced portrayal and a overwhelmingly biased and prejudiced by the media itself, or by the media allowing itself to be used by populist and extreme nationalist politicians or groups.
Koliko je obrazovanje bitno kako bi Romi postali vidljivi u sistemu?
Well, education is known to be one of the most powerful drives to produce positive outcomes. It has an essential role in early formation of the individual, and then it builds and adds layers upon layers to develop the person into an individual that is mature, is skilled enough, has a good understanding of his or her role in society and how to contribute to the society. And that's regardless of racial or ethnic origin. For Roma, education is also important, is among the most important drives and factors for achieving success and inclusion. And perhaps this is one of the fields or the areas where all the efforts done in the past 15 years or so by governments, by international organizations, by intergovernmental organizations, by civil society and various donors has registered success. You can see an increase in the number of Roma children participating in preschool education and being part of early childhood development processes that are essential for the upbringing of children. Then you can see an increase in the number of Roma children entering primary school and successfully transitioning to the secondary and more to high school and tertiary education. In my previous professional capacity, I was the manager of international higher education scholarship program. It's about Roma Education Fund, working in 16 countries, with the scholarship program having every year roughly 2 million euro given out to approximately 1,500 students every year. Now, if you compare this with 10 years ago, there were perhaps 200-300 students, Roma students. The demand is even higher, so it's obvious that investment in education pays off. It's the way to work on. In my very brief intervention today, I acknowledge the importance of this, but I also hinted to a kind of a systemic problem. The experience of Roma Education Fund, all the projects, including the scholarship for the tertiary education, and many other good education relation initiatives, they all have a problem. They are not taken on board by the countries, or it's a very incipient stage to an extent to which such good practices are taken over by the state to transform them in public policies, and even more importantly, to break this dependency on Roma-related initiatives on EU funding. Overwhelmingly, one could see in Europe that most of these Roma-related initiatives, they happen with funding from EU or Norway funding and so on. That's not the way. It was for a much earlier stage where there was a need to pilot all sorts of approaches to help diagnosing, identifying the problems and the needs, as well as the opportunities, and eventually build approaches and practices that work. Now, these practices and projects, they worked for a limited number of people in order to produce a systemic change, because again, we speak of a very large population. In Europe, up to 12 million Roma, many of them living in a destitute situation. You need to have a serious approach after at least 10 years of piloting all sorts of projects, initiatives and so on with the EU funding. It's time that the governments are taking over these good practices and start funding them as public policies from the state budget. We speak here of Roma being citizens of their respective countries. So the responsibility should never lie outside of the country, but firstly with the government. And that's what we have also in OSCE. In OSCE, in 2003, all 57 participating states, as they are nowadays, they adopted an OSCE action plan to improve the situation of Roma and Sinti. That's been 16 years ago. And since then, all sorts of pilot initiatives have been developed and implemented. If one would be honest and look deep into the situation of all these initiatives, we'll find only a very small percentage of upscaling of these initiatives into public policies, and then having them budgeted from the state. So that's the problem. That's perhaps the biggest problem. Yeah.
Kada biste mogli da ponudite jedan savet zemljama u regionu, na osnovu vašeg iskustva u socijalnom uključivanju Roma, šta biste im poručili?
Roma are still insufficiently involved in the processes that concern them. It's important to acknowledge that the level of skills, expertise, experience, and when we speak of civil society, the level of organizational and institutional development is not what it should be. We speak of a population that faced lack of education, unemployment, discrimination, exclusion, and so on. But still, it's about them, and the OSCE says nothing about Roma without Roma. And throughout Europe you can see examples where Roma were involved, but the examples are also illustrating that the involvement is insufficient and still superficial. Very often you see people at events But when it's about taking part in the real processes, like, designing the policies, developing the policies, then being part of the implementation, then later on being part of the processes to evaluate those policies, revise them and update them, it's not happening, or it's still very, very insufficiently. There is still paternalism and patronizing, and on the long run, this will not produce the intended results. By now, at least those thousands of graduates from higher education, they have the skills, they have the experience to be properly used by state institutions in all these processes. If you would hear them, they would complain that they don't have such opportunities, and that would be my recommendation for the states.
Gospodine Dogi, hvala vam što ste govorili za Hroniku nacionalnih manjina.
I thank you very much.